Hello, I'm Jeffrey Williams, and we are too late for the gods. I recently came across a very short video on a channel titled Inspiring Philosophy, where an apologist named Michael Jones misuses a highly speculative theory of a holographic universe to support the cosmological argument for God. I link to that video below. Jones' statement lasts barely a minute, so I will play it in its entirety here and then break it down.
Well, in the past couple of decades, they have found something in physics called the holographic principle. Now, they talk about the universe as a hologram analogously, that it sort of emerges from this underlying information processing. So a lot of what the evidence is pointing to is this idea the universe is emergent. So a famous atheist physicist named Sean Carroll has said, space is obviously not fundamental. Space is something that when you go from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, space more or less disappears. So our space-time, which is our universe, we call it space-time as well, is emergent from underlying information processing. Now, myself as a theist says, well, that just strengthens the contingency arguments, cosmological arguments. If the entire space-time is emergent itself, it's got to be emergent on something more fundamental than what we see, what we experience. And what a lot of apologists and philosophers have been arguing is that it would be emergent from a mind. So the underlying universe that the universe emerges from would have to be, could not be material. It would have to be immaterial, obviously. It'd have to be spaceless and timeless. And so the most likely explanation would be the same thing you get from other cosmological arguments. It would be an immaterial, necessary mind.
He starts with, they have found something in physics called the holographic principle. He presents this as if it were a discovery. In reality, it's a speculative idea in string theory that is barely more than a hypothesis put forward by a small number of physicists. He goes on to say, emerges from some sort of information processing. This leads to an interesting problem. When apologists dabble in science, they fail to realize how metaphorical science really is, but then so do many scientists. This is why some apologists take the metaphor of DNA as a code literally, and from that argue there must be an intelligent coder who designed the universe. Physics since Newton is expressed in two ways, mathematics and metaphorical interpretations from the mathematics. For instance, our concept of atoms has progressed from monads to electron planets orbiting a nucleus to electron clouds. Of course, atoms are really not monads, solar systems, or clouds, and quantum field theory now gives us new insights which require a new metaphor altogether. Our current focus on physics as information and our heavy reliance on computers has led to the recent metaphor of the universe as a giant computer crunching cosmic information. This has even led some to stretch the metaphor where they posit consciousness as elemental and primary to the universe and the mechanism for this information processing. In neuroscience, conscious understanding of the world is sometimes seen as the creation of icons from a manifold of sense data that simplify the ones and zeros of the universe into something we can grasp and manipulate. That is, our conscious mind as graphic interface. The metaphor of the universe emerging from information processing leads some apologists to see this as evidence that God exists as this universal mind. But keep in mind, this is just one more metaphor in the chain and will someday be replaced by others, and a metaphor not universally accepted by physicists anyway. Jones's introduction of Sean Carroll into the discussion only underscores his general ignorance of the physics. Jones states, Sean Carroll says space is obviously not fundamental. Space is something that when you go from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics, space pretty much disappears. So our space time is emergent from underlying information processes. Jones apparently does not know that Sean Carroll believes space-time is emergent from the purely physical nature of gravity, not information or cosmic consciousness. As you will see in this short clip, Carroll actually rejects the hypothesis that information processing is the fundamental nature of the universe and characterizes it as the error of taking a metaphor literally.
Sean, I love digging at reality, seeing what's there, how much deeper can we go, and what do we find at the deepest level? Laws of physics, quantum mechanics certainly are one of the candidates, string theory. Some people will now talk about information being not just a metaphor of describing what these things mean, but rather something that's even more fundamental, that information itself is what gives rise to everything else, like quantum mechanics. How do you see that?
I'll confess that my opinions about information are not completely mature. I'm willing to have my mind changed by good arguments. But having said that, I tend to think of information in very similar ways that I would think about ideas like entropy or energy, which is to say they are ways of describing reality, but they are not absolutely fundamental necessary ingredients of any description. We could get along without talking about information, just like we could get along without ever talking about energy.
Okay, we could do that, we could get along without it, even if it were something that were fundamental. But you're saying, as far as you can tell, there's no reason to believe that information is somehow a deeper foundation than the laws of physics.
I don't think information is deeper than the laws of physics. I think it gives us a useful handle. I think of it as a description, but I only hesitate in saying that because it sounds like I'm downplaying it. I think it's an incredibly useful handle, a really sharp tool that helps us understand how reality works. But it is a tool. It is not an absolutely essential part of reality itself.
Jones further displays his naivete when he refers to our space-time, which is universal. There are two problems here. First, there is no universal space-time. As Einstein demonstrated, there are as many space-times as there are relative perspectives. Even here on Earth, clocks run faster at higher altitudes than at lower altitudes because mass slows down local time. Second, and most importantly, he separates our universe from whatever fundamental reality exists from which space-time emerges. Space-time is our relative experience of the universe, and the underlying quantum reality is every bit as much a part of our universe as our experience at the classical level, perhaps even more so. Jones attempts to describe the underlying reality from which space-time emerges as something outside our universe to restore an opening to the metaphysical. If you can misuse the metaphor of information processing as the most fundamental reality, he can slip into a claim of God as ultimate fundamentality. To do that, he takes us on a diversion that begins. If the entire space-time is emergent itself, it has to be emergent from something else than what we see, what we experience. It's got to be emergent on something more fundamental. He repeats his error of an entire space-time and then introduces the notion of that which we cannot experience, another way of saying metaphysics. In so doing, he slides into characterizing this element from which space-time emerges as non-physical. This is, of course, directly opposed to what the vast majority of leading physicists posit. Sean Carroll and Carlo Rovelli, among others, built theories of emergence from quantum gravity, a decidedly physical element. In a slightly different formulation, Roger Penrose posits time as emergent from mass. Contra Jones, space-time emerges from quantum reality, which we in fact do perceive in particle accelerators. His misrepresentation allows him to slide into this false conclusion. And what a lot of apologists and philosophers have been arguing, he says, is it would be emergent from a mind. So the underlying universe, which the universe emerges from, could not be material. It would have to be immaterial. Obviously, it would have to be spaceless and timeless, so the most likely explanation would be the same thing we get from other cosmological arguments. It would be an immaterial, necessary mind. Now, as I had just demonstrated, most physicists see quantum reality as the underlying fundamentality from which space-time emerges, with no need to refer to mind at all. But he also misleads when he claims mind cannot be material. At the quantum field level, material has no more meaning than space-time. Matter, or mass, only emerges from the interaction of the Higgs field with other fields. But lack of mass doesn't imply non-physical. In fact, Winger conflates immaterial with non-physical. Quantum fields are energy. As such, they are the underlying base of physical reality existing prior to matter, space, and time. But they are physical and of this universe. With his primitively naive concept of space-time, matter, and physicality, he's really in no position to claim the mind exists anywhere other than within the physical universe. Although in its infancy, quantum theory of mind already sheds more light on consciousness than anything preceding it and beckons toward an end to the medieval notion of duality. So, no, the most likely argument is not one of an immaterial, necessary mind. It is far more likely that mind emerges from quantum reality in the same way as matter, space, and time, as elementary wave activity. Jones's error isn't unique, but of a type common among apologists who insist on trying to breathe life into the long ago debunked metaphysical proofs of God. YouTube and Twitter apologists often argue in this manner, naively out of a general lack of understanding of physics. More prominent apologists such as William Lane Craig do the same, but with more cynicism and rhetorical talent.